Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Optimizing Live. Thanks for joining us. If you've been a part of or you've watched any of our past live events, you kind of get a feel for how Randy and I are approaching this. Today, we're going to continue our conversation around AI adoption, continue to talk about what we're learning with companies that we're working with and the colleagues that we're working with. And the intent, as always, is just to get the conversation started and to help kind of share our experiences as we're learning and hopefully help you think about how you can optimize your AI adoption within your organization. How you doing this morning, Randy?
Doing great. How's it going, Richard?
Good. So we've had this ongoing conversation about adopting AI, and we spent a lot of time really talking about the blockers that people are seeing in their organization, because you and I both know, being longtime consultants and coaches working with organizations trying to help them transform in many areas, we often find that, bringing about real change, whether it's AI or agile or anything else, again, that really requires significant focus as an organization, is a lot harder than it seems. And a lot of that comes down to, again, the impediments, the blockers that exist. Some are self-created, some are just kind of ingrained into the organizational inertia. I think today we wanted to pivot just a little bit, or rather extend that and say, all right, so how do we start to break through some of these blockers, and how do we really start to optimize, what we're trying to solve for with AI?
Yeah, to me, I think the biggest thing is just the mindset, right? We've seen it for decades now. I guess for me, I would say I go back maybe 12 years to the first really large organizational transformation that I was a part of. And the same patterns that existed then exist today, which is most leaders in the organization, and unless you have a C in front of your title, really don't zoom out, right? Like, they look at their scope, and they look down and look at, how do I make things better? There's not really an inclination to zoom out and say, how do we really make our overall system better? And I think when you look at that through the lens of AI, it's the same challenge. Is like, we can optimize our silo, or we can zoom out and figure out, how do we better optimize across the entire system? And I think that, for me, continues to be one of the biggest opportunities. And I just had a post this morning on LinkedIn talking about systems thinking it's the critical success factor. So how do we dial that up, and how do we create the environment so we're able to have these zoomed out conversations?
Yeah. It's such a simple concept, right? Of being able to, quote, zoom out, see the landscape, understand the totality of your organizational systems. But then, it requires some agility of the brain to be able to then zoom back in with that context. And while I think a lot of leaders certainly have the intellectual, and they get it, they understand some of this, that function of zooming out and then zooming back in and having the clarity so that our strategy makes sense, how we then go execute makes sense. It's easier said than done. And this is not unique to AI adoption, because this is something we've seen with patterns for organizations for many, many years. There's just so many things going on in an organization, so many risks to manage, so many challenges, that it can be a bit overwhelming. And I think one of as we talked again about blockers over the last several weeks, one of the blockers is just that organizational inertia. And sometimes we call it analysis paralysis, whatever you want to call it. But the idea to zoom out, get just enough clarity, so then you can zoom back in and have something that you can start to take action against. I think that's pretty critical.
Yeah. And I think another aspect of that organizational challenge is how courageous are the leaders. And when I say that, what I mean specifically is, do you have the right kind of leaders who have the right kind of courage to look at the system and say, like, I think there's probably some shades between, but there's sort of two ends of the spectrum, which is, how do I optimize so I win versus how do I optimize so we win?
Yeah.
Right. And sadly, I mean, I've had conversations with VPs who report directly to the CIO who say, look, like, I get this big picture stuff. All I want to know is, how do I optimize for all the people that report up to me? And I think that's where, just even from a culture perspective, what kind of leaders do you have? And that's where the leadership piece of this is, and the system, what we call the adaptive operating model, which basically just means, do you have the ability to look at these things like, how are these different VPs and departments measured and rewarded and incentivized? And, a lot of them, it's like, they're like, hey, it's risky for me to try and optimize across silos. Mm-hmm. I can control my silo. I know how, my system works. I know how to play that game. So I'm just going to keep playing that game. And so I think for senior leaders, it's how do you sort of bring down that barrier and make it safer for that cross-functional collaboration, even at the senior most leadership levels.
Yeah. I mean, what you just highlighted was one of the top blockers that we discovered through our survey, is essentially governance, mm-hmm. right? And, it's not, we use a term, I think, in the poll of overly complex governance. And I don't think it's so much about complexity in the governance. It's just that it's too rigid, right? And our hierarchies and our compliance, they're there for a reason, right? They have value, but they're a little bit rigid. And to your point, it becomes easier just I'm going to kind of stay in my lane and focus on my part of the hierarchy. And there's certainly risk involved if I'm trying to go outside of that norm and trying to start crossing boundaries. But that's the reality of organizational change, whether we're talking about AI or anything else, is that we have to be able to recognize the boundaries of our hierarchy, our bureaucracies, but then work within them. Yeah. And so I think the big question becomes, how can we turn governance, bureaucracy, compliance into an enabler, right, that allows us to safely traverse the organization as we need to take advantage of these things?
Yeah, I like to think of it through the lens of, like, here's your litmus test. When it comes to governance, does governance feel like it's a capability in the organization that helps me safely do the right thing quickly? Or is it something that prevents me from exploring the things I want to explore and just feels like it's in the way and slowing me down, right? And those are two ends of the spectrum. But I think, like, you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. I think this is probably fair to share. Richard and I had the privilege of presenting to NASA, and just like any organization, there's all manner of constraints within the system. Mm-hmm. You can appreciate NASA has like massive, what I call capital C constraints, legislative level constraints to deal with. But, they, just like any organization, they also have their fair share of things that they've put in place to try and, prevent the wrong things from happening, mm-hmm. that make it a lot harder for people to just do the right thing quickly. And, we heard some of those stories, and, luckily we got to talk to the group that's trying to help fix that and make things faster. So yeah, I like that litmus test of just like, how does it feel? Right. It's like, it feels bad. It feels like it's just in my way. Then do you have the ability to go have a healthy conversation about that to figure out how do we change it? Or is that conversation like locked behind some hidden door somewhere, and like you don't even know how to broach the topic? You know, that's another thing to look out for, because in our work with organizations, we're trying to bring together like, what's that right group of leaders, the right mix of leaders to help remove those, you know, those impediments to doing the right thing faster.
Yeah. I mean, it's challenging, no question. And if an organization has kind of a set of cultural norms that says we can't question our processes, we can't question our rules, then you're going to be restricted to a certain path. And so in this case, one of the things that we've been talking about is, all right, so we sense that there's a blocker from a quote governance perspective. So do you just ignore that? Do you navigate around that? Or do you bring those people into the conversation? So we talk about tensions in organizations, and the challenge is not to remove the tension, but to manage it, to seek some form of balance. And so the strategy, again, quite simple in my mind, is we need to have not just have conversations with these people. And I say these people, I'm talking about the people that kind of own and are responsible for protecting us as an organization through our compliance and our policies. They need to be a part of something like this. They need to have a seat at the table so that we can negotiate and find balance between, all right, what are some of the policies that are in play here, and how can we work within that? And a lot of organizations, again, just might tend to, full stop, well, we're blocked, we can't do anything, versus, all right, we understand what the constraints are. Now let's work on those constraints. And, we do need to have obviously shared vision. And another challenge that hierarchies create is, while there's probably some big organizational vision, if all I'm doing is staying in my lane and you're staying in your lane, we start to create our own definition of that rather than seeing it holistically. So it's certainly a fair blocker, but I think it's one that's easily negotiated.
Yeah. Yeah. Like everything you were just saying, my head went to the workshop offer that we've built, which is to help organizations do what you described earlier, like zoom out and zoom in, in an effective and healthy way, and look at what are some current workflows, work streams, value streams, processes, however you want to describe it, but where do we have like our biggest opportunities, and how do we look at it through the lens of, we have our current process. What's an AI native, AI enabled future state look like? And like, when I say AI native, what I mean is, we're not taking the 11 steps in that process and saying, how do we make step 1 better with AI? How do we make step 2 better with AI, right? It's, how do we reimagine it? Like, maybe that process is fine as it is. More often than not, there's opportunities to rethink it. And, as I like to say, like, take the opportunity with AI to address some of these, organizational impediments and dysfunctions. So it's really kind of like, it's a 2-for-1 in terms of the benefit. Like, you get the opportunity to potentially re-architect how your business operates and take advantage of AI at the same time. And in that workshop, what we do, like, it's a multifaceted approach. It's not just current state, future state, like how do we save time? How do we save money? How do we speed up the process? Those things are all critically important, but also layering on like what specifically does AI do? Like what's the role AI plays? And then in balancing that, what's the role that the human plays in that? And like being clear, being explicit, because AI effectively just becomes another team member in that context. And so if we design with intentionality, I think the thing that we bring to it that, in doing my competitive market research, I haven't seen a focus on this. So hopefully no other consulting firms are watching this, because I do think this is somewhat of our secret sauce and advantage, but we layer on what are the change management impacts. Like that seems obvious, but I don't see a lot of it in the messaging out in the market from other consultancies. And most importantly, what are the operating model impacts, right? Like we have this 2-state that we're trying to move to. And just like we were talking about 10 minutes ago, you've got leaders in the organization who the current operating model is designed in a certain way to help them focus, give them control over their functional area. And if they like that and it's working for them and they're able to like get their full, variable comp bonus every year because they know how their system works and how to deliver against that, like good for them. But, we've all seen plenty of opportunities where we optimize at the silo level and we leave a whole crap ton of benefit on the table at the higher organizational level.
Yeah. So touching back on the idea of zooming out, I think one of the challenges, at least for me, has been in the solid year and a half that I've really been rolling up my sleeves and digging into this is, what is the AI landscape? You and I are longtime Agile coaches, and some of the ways we would talk about Agile would be, well, just think about it as this umbrella, and underneath that umbrella are all sorts of methods, frameworks, et cetera. And, when we say AI, I mean, that's a fairly, vague term. And so I think what it's important for me, at least when I'm having a conversation, when I'm talking about, organizations adopting AI, I think it's important to understand what does that really mean? Are we talking about, an AI tool like a Copilot, for example, that's built into our suite of tools that we use? Or are we talking about the GPT type AI, generative AI? Are we talking about building agents? Are we actually building robots? So I think part of the thing that organizations need to start with from a strategic perspective is understand the landscape and make sure that they can apply that to their organizational context. Now, then when we zoom in, as you said earlier, then we can be a little bit more precise and say, all right, where in our organization is there a use case or a function or a value stream within our organization that makes sense for us to start learning, right? And then as we do that, we can then calibrate, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? And to your point earlier, there's certainly plenty of concern out there that, AI is going to be replacing people. That's true of any innovation, right? And then the challenge then becomes, how do we understand the context of what we're solving for here and try to avoid that local or siloed optimization. Be able to then zoom back out again and understand, all right, what have we learned and where could we apply this again? It could be a one-off, or it could be something that, is applicable widespread to their operating model. And, if the strategy is, well, we just need to be doing AI because it's the thing, like anything else, it's going to get you so far. But if you have the ability to really understand the landscape and understand how do you bring that into your context, that to me is certainly an important starting point.
Yeah. There's two things that come to mind for me that based on what you were just saying, it triggered a couple of thoughts. One is I can't escape the parallel to the emergence of DevOps. And I always describe like the DevOps maturity cycle, super oversimplified, but it's like if you had no DevOps capability, you did not have a team or an organization with DevOps in their title. If you were building your DevOps capability, you probably had a team or teams or an organization with DevOps in their title as they were building the capability. As they built the capability and you started to integrate it into everything, so it just sort of became part of how we work. The other end of the scale is we're super mature because we don't have teams that are called DevOps, right? I think that same pattern is largely applicable from the AI perspective. It's like if you look around and you don't have any teams labeled AI, either you have no capability there or you're super mature and you've already gone through that whole journey and you've just integrated it everywhere. So I like that as a litmus test. And then I know we were talking before we jumped on here about some articles that we were kind of researching just to find stories of some compelling things that are maybe a little bit more amplifying the things that we're seeing directly. And I like the Wall Street Journal article. It's a few months old at this point, but it talks about Johnson and Johnson and some of the journey that they've been on already, right? Initially, they had over 900 generative AI use cases that were across the organization, but they had a centralized governance board. Mm-hmm. And then what they learned was it was, 15% or less of those efforts were delivering 80% of the value, which, as I always like to say, that Pareto guy was really onto something, right? And what did they learn from that, and how did they pivot, right? Like they moved to a more decentralized governance model. So, right, how do we remove some of the complexity from a governance? They created more empowerment and autonomy at more local levels in the organization. And, they really tightened their focus on where were the high value wins. And I think that's a good pattern. I think you have to be careful to not say, wow, the fact that they had 900 use cases and 85% of them were barely delivering any value, that's not a bad thing, right? It's understand your context. Early in that journey, learning is critical. Making it safe to experiment is critical, right? Like the 85% of things that delivered little to no value, what was the learning value of those? What did that enable the people who, participated in that to do subsequent to that? And make sure that you're balancing that. Because I think if you overly constrain it too early in the journey and you impede the broader organizational ability to learn and grow and adapt and figure out we just figured out 5 awesome ways not to ever do this again. Like there's value there.
Yeah. Yeah. And not to keep going back to the same theme of hierarchies and bureaucracy, but I think, again, one of the blockers in that scenario that you just described often is that because we've got these silos, those silos prevent cross learning, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea of, I was having a conversation last night, the idea of learning from each other's experiences, successes or failures, I think is super critical in this case of, are we able to truly experiment in a disciplined way, bring rigor into that, and then be more than just transparent, but be actually intentional about how do we share what we've learned, whether it was a failure, labeled a failure or not. And there's that goes again back to organizational culture and norms, which is just that continuous reminder that when we're talking about AI adoption, it's not just about the technology. I mean, certainly that's critical. I'm not a technologist. So I'm approaching this topic, this idea, from the perspective of leadership, from culture, just how do we make things work? How can leadership and individual contributors and teams work more effectively together with AI, whether we're using terminology like native or enabled, et cetera. And those silos are getting in our way, but the ability to try something, to learn from it, and then understand the context of, is this applicable in your part of the organization, or is this unique to my part of the business or my part of the operating model?
Yeah.
Another topic, just to kind of keep it moving along, another thing that we've been talking about is essentially talent gap. And is your organization, are you equipped from a talent perspective to be able to really embrace this idea of adopting AI? And for a lot of organizations, aside from the core pure tech companies, a lot of organizations, I'm guessing, have a pretty big talent gap. And this is not, in my mind, just something that we are going to relegate to IT. For most organizations, I think everyone from the C-level down to the individual contributor need to be educated, need to be trained, need to get those hands-on skills, so that what they're doing for their organization is something that is not just a one-off. Okay, yeah, I'm using this tool or I'm using this model, but it gives them the ability to evolve as AI is going to continue to evolve. I mean, the learning curve, we all know the learning curve here is very steep. It's very dramatic. It continues to evolve. I took a training a while back, and I'm sure that a good chunk of what I learned in that training is probably already obsolete to an extent, because the tools and some of the concepts have already started to evolve. Yeah, go ahead.
In the meetup, so Richard and I were at a local meetup last night where our colleague Brad Swanson was presenting, and there were a couple of interesting conversations that emerged. Like Brad's talk was on the clear parallels that we're seeing in terms of like the era of agile transformation that once was, I guess, if we leverage Richard's recent talk at the regional Scrum gathering, right? Like we're in the post-transformation era. But if you think about it, like how challenging was that for organizations? And look at that through two interesting comparative lenses. One, how hard was it to do Scrum well? And how frequently was Scrum changing? Right? Scrum was changing what? Maybe every 3 to 5 years there was an update to the Scrum guide. Like compare that rate of change to like the rate of change with AI. Like it's got to be 1,000-fold faster.
Easily. And to be clear, the changes over the years to the Scrum guide, in my humble opinion, were relatively
nuanced, right?
They were just a reflection of the evolution as we learn. We adapted a few things, right? Which is obviously agile. There's no way to really correlate the changes from an AI perspective, because we're not just talking about changing a couple of terminologies or refining and things. We're talking about an evolving technology, an evolving, scope in terms of organizational consciousness, in terms of ethics, in terms of all of this. So, I mean, to me, it's sometimes a little overwhelming, to be honest, that, for me, as I'm continuing to learn, I'm not going to lie, I occasionally get a little overwhelmed and wonder, am I ever going to be able to catch up? Am I able to keep up with the pace of this evolving technology, this evolving phenomena? But yes, using that as an example, and that was challenging for many, many organizations. This is certainly putting it at a whole different level.
Yeah, and there's been a couple of really awesome comments in the chat that I do want to address. I'm going to go back to like the second point from the meetup conversation last night, which was change resistance and comparing change resistance in the agile transformation era to what's happening with AI, like the parallel that jumped to mind for me is some of the principal forms of change resistance was if you were an engineer, you might look at how I've been working and how like we want to work in an agile way. And like there were plenty of engineers who like, I don't really want to work that way. Like I like having, you know, something that I can focus on and I can go heads down and sure, like I'm going to have some collaboration with peers, but you know, it's not nearly as much as in an agile construct. The other big thing from like a changing how we work part of the change resistance was this notion of, I'm not sure I want to do that new role, right? Project managers, like in a lot of the transformations I was a part of, you know, you always had some subset of like project managers, like probably the number one pattern, certainly that I saw was, oh, well, we'll take the project managers and make them scrum masters. Well, sometimes that works, like, but sometimes you have project managers who are like, that's not what I want to do. That's not how I, you know, view myself and how I want to work. Similarly, you know, the role of product owner in an agile environment, you have people who are like made the most logical sense and they might also choose like, I'm not sure I want to do that. So you went from, I'm not sure I want to wear that hat or play that role or work that way to like the parallel from an AI perspective is I'm not sure I'm going to have a job potentially, building on the comment in the chat here, right? Around Accenture, right? Does it make sense for Accenture to say we're laying off 11,000 people because of the ability to learn AI? I'm sorry. I agree. Is there such a thing as an inability to learn AI? My hot take on that is you hired 11,000 people that can't be retrained to operate in an AI world. It's like, how bad hires were those to begin with? Sorry if you're one of those 11,000 people. Like, I would like to give you more credit than that. That sounds like my BS detector is going off big time on that.
Yeah. Well, my take on that is if I can learn this stuff, anybody can. And throughout my consulting and coaching career, one of the things I did learn years ago is to not limit my expectations on what people can learn and how they can adapt.
Yeah.
And, you know, I believe that, you know, most of us, the vast majority of us, certainly in these professional fields, we do have the capability to learn and adapt. It's complicated, right? But, you know, the idea that, you know, to your point, you apparently hired people that then you ultimately determined weren't skilled enough or smart enough. Yeah, and that happens with every organization, right? So I don't really have an issue with identifying that in an organization, but I think it's a big red flag for me to say, you know, hey, these people don't have the capacity to learn this, because the reality is we all have the capacity to learn. And again, that's for me, I was a little reluctant to start dipping my toes in the AI waters a couple of years ago. But once I did, as I said, it's overwhelming for me sometimes, but it's really critical. And so that's certainly a red flag for me when I look at an organization that does that.
I'm going to double down on my Accenture hot take. If what they said is true, I hope to hell you are not paying Accenture to do AI training in your organization.
All right. You're poking the bear.
And I do want to make one more comment there. I know we're over our allocated window. Real quick, there's another great comment in the chat. What is the better architecture, humans in the loop, like many suggest, or humans first, the Agile Manifesto? I do think that, you know, there's kind of a leading paradigm that you see referenced a lot, which is treat AI like it's a teammate, right? And treat AI like it's a very junior teammate, not to be trusted. And so given the context of, you know, the process, the part of the business, the value stream that you're operating in, I like to look at, you know, again, third time in this conversation, I use a spectrum, but it's like for any given thing you're trying to solve for, is it data intensive? Is it very empirically driven? Like we can, establish a formula and it's highly predictive? Or on the other end of the spectrum, how much human intuition and judgment and gut feel, right? And like you're sort of like reading the tea leaves and applying judgment and applying, your experience. Like if it's that kind of a scenario, to me, it's a humans first scenario, right?
Yeah.
If it's more like the analytical, where it's highly predictive, humans in the loop is probably, I guess that's how I would answer that.
Yeah, I agree. So once again, great conversation. So if you're out there, if you're wondering, how can you help your organization adopt AI? How can you break through some of the blockers or impediments that you think might get in the way, right? It all starts with having a conversation and then kind of taking the appropriate steps. If you'd like to reach out to us online, follow our LinkedIn page, please do so. Randy and I are going to be doing a workshop in a couple of weeks that is essentially around this topic of continuing to understand the AI blockers and then how to optimize for the impact that you want as an organization. So thanks for joining this episode of LinkedIn Live. And again, follow us on LinkedIn or look us up if you'd like to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Randy.
I just posted the link to the Eventbrite for the Accelerating AI that you just referenced. So yeah, plenty of free early bird tickets available. Join us.
All right. Sounds good.